Hello, everyone. Welcome to this evening's virtual event with Brookline Booksmith, featuring Robert Jones Jr., celebrating the paperback release of his book, The Prophets, in conversation with Torrey Peters. My name is Bonnie, and I'm a bookseller at Brookline Booksmith in Brookline, Massachusetts. If you're familiar with our store, welcome back. And if this is the first time you're hearing about us, welcome. We're so happy to have everybody join our community this evening. And we really appreciate your support of these authors and an independent bookstore through your purchases and attendance. And now allow me to introduce our incredible guests for the evening. Tonight's moderator, Torrey Peters, is the author of the novellas Infect Your Friends and Loved Ones and The Masker, which are available for free on her website. She holds an MFA from the University of Iowa and an MA in comparative literature from Dartmouth. Her first novel, Detransition Baby, was longlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction. She grew up in Chicago and now splits her time between Brooklyn and an off-the-grid cabin in Vermont. And the most important fact, she rides a pink motorcycle. And to introduce tonight's author, Robert Jones Jr. is the New York Times bestselling author of The Prophets, which is a finalist for the 2021 National Book Award for Fiction. Robert Jones Jr. was born and raised in New York City. He received his BFA in creative writing with honors and MFA in fiction from Brooklyn College. He has written for numerous publications, including the New York Times, Essence, and the Paris Review. He's the creator and curator of the social justice social media community Son of Baldwin, which has over 288,000 followers across platforms. And a lot of you may have read the book, but for those who didn't, I'll give you a little introduction. The Prophets is a singular and stunning debut about the forbidden union between two enslaved young men, Isaiah and Samuel, on a deep South plantation, the refuge they find in each other, and a betrayal that threatens their existence. With a lyricism reminiscent of Toni Morrison, Robert Jones Jr. fiercely summons the voice of slaver and enslaved alike. As tensions build and the weight of centuries of ancestors and of future generations culminates in a climactic reckoning, The Prophets fearlessly reveals the pain and suffering of inheritance, but also is shot through with hope, beauty, and truth, portraying the enormous, heroic power of love. This is the part where I would tell you the kind of lists and awards that the book has been featured on, but I lost count in doing research. It's been on so many best book lists and nominated for prizes. It's a spectacular story. I think the New York Times book review described it perfectly when they called it a lyrical and rebellious love story reaching across centuries. I, for one, am excited to hear the two of you speak. Everyone make some noise in the chat for Robert Jones Jr. and Torrey Peters. Woo!
Torrey.
Hi, it's lovely to be here with you. I guess I'll start out by saying that I've been on a couple of Zooms now, and that you're the most hospitable Zoom guest that I've dealt with, because you always have the books of your interlocutors behind you, which I think is just like, it's the most welcoming thing. And I think and that leads me to say that I promised myself that next time that I would talk to you, I would have your book on the shelf behind me to return that hospitality. But I am currently in Colombia, so I didn't have a copy, but I want everyone to imagine also a copy behind me. I mean, this book blew me away, which, as we heard in the introduction, it seemed to have blown everybody away. But I was wondering if maybe, just so people who haven't heard it can get a taste for the language, if we could maybe start out with like a little reading, and then we'll just jump into the conversation.
Sure. I am going to be reading from a chapter called Ruth. And for people who have not read the book, Ruth is the mistress of the plantation that our protagonists are enslaved on. And she finds herself caught in this really interesting place, because though she is white, and that gives her a certain level of privilege, she is also a woman, and that leaves her completely vulnerable in many ways. And so in this chapter, I try to kind of explore that tension a bit, but I'm just going to read a brief little section for you today. Ruth's green eyes were glazed over with memory, so she wasn't sure if what she saw before her now was, she wasn't sure if what she saw before her was now or then. But there was a light in the distance, shining downward from where she couldn't discern. In the light, there was the silhouette of a man, tall and straight, perhaps with a rifle cast over his shoulder, but unlikely a soldier. There was little need for soldiers now that the land had been captured and the savages that resided in this place before were tamed and would soon be erased by means she was unafraid to articulate. For the rules were different under acts of war. Though women were not permitted to fight in the official declarations of such, official was key for two reasons. First, some women disguised themselves as men, took on the exact visage and manner of men, from the short hair to the aggressive gait, to do what they believed was the patriotic thing. She knew of one such woman who was hanged when discovered, not for the fighting, for she heard that she had fought even better than the men, but for the deception, which they claimed was more than just her disguise. It was in the way she lived, even in the times of peace, rejecting she for he, an affront to Christ. Second, women endured a more lasting, thus a more brutal combat in merely trying to survive men. Whether men had seen battle or not, each of them, to one degree or another, came home from wherever it is men go to be with themselves or to do the things they would never admit to out loud, with the same intent to inflict whatever harms they endured from the world onto the women and children closest to them. Relation didn't matter. Mother, wife, sister, and daughter were all equally targeted for the same rage. Father, husband, brother, and son all had the same blank regard in their eyes. There, behind the glistening fury, was the thing that shook them so thoroughly that they felt the need to destroy anything and anyone who they believed could see it. Nothing. Whenever and wherever nothing encounters something, conflict is inevitable. Ruth wondered if the figure in the light carrying the rifle was then coming to start a war with her. She took a step back. She blinked, and the figure and the light were gone. Only unyielding blackness was there now. And strangely, it comforted her.
That was beautiful. It's funny to say that's beautiful because actually that was one of the more exciting chapters to me in the book. I mean, it is beautiful, but Ruth is a incredible and difficult difficult character for me to read and the things that she does. But hearing that, I'm curious, and this is just as a fellow author, how do you choose what excerpts you read at things like this?
You know, it's very difficult. At first, my publisher and my editor and my publicist and my agent, they were all like, read the chapters with Samuel and Isaiah, with something that crystallizes their relationships. So I would scour the book and say, okay, this one's a good one, or that one's a good one. And then that was the first struggle. And then the second struggle was, well, how long should I be reading? Like, and then they'll go, oh, read for 15 minutes, but how long is 15 minutes in pages? Like, so it's just so hard to know because I can't keep track of time and read. So now what I do is I say, okay, I'm going to read from this thought until that thought is finished. If that's like a page and a half, that's fine. And that's all I'm going to read. And now I choose randomly, like, who do I want to hear from this? Whose perspective do I want to see this time? I want to read something that's going to excite me because at some point I was reading the same passages over and over and I was getting bored. So I started like choosing different characters to read from.
That makes sense to me. I had a similar thing happen, and I found myself reading over time sort of the minor characters that I almost wanted to save the major story. Like I was like, I don't want to give you 3 minutes of the major story. Like it's not going to do it justice. So I found myself. I mean, it's interesting that you did Ruth, because I basically read from the sort of like Ruth equivalent characters in my book, because I'm sort of like, here's a little taste of somebody where I can give you like, that's sort of like how much I thought about. I didn't think about them the same way that I would have thought about, you know, my equivalent of Samuel and Isaiah. And so I felt like, okay, sharing it. So I was curious, like how, like, is that what led to the Ruth thing? And then of course, just, you know, what feels like a complete thought. I mean, I'm interested. Sorry, go ahead.
My husband's favorite character in the book is Ruth.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he likes antagonists. He thinks they're more interesting, and so he's like, oh, the Ruth Trap chapter for him was like the best chapter in the book. He loved that chapter.
I mean, I relate to that. I do like a complicated villain or a you know, somebody who you. I mean, I felt like James was that way too. That I was expecting to sort of, you know, the way that, like, you know, don't say his name, that sort of thing. And then when I got to him, I was like, oh, this is way more complicated. This character is way more complicated than I expected. And I thought of, like, it's a different thing, but I thought of like Pan's Labyrinth, the movie. And I thought about like how the evil dictator like had like father issues and stuff like that. And I wonder, this is a little bit off track, but I think of actually the two different models for doing a villain. One being that you empathize with them, or the other being like in sort of like Blood Meridian or something, where you just let them be absolute evil. And I wonder, like, which way do you ever do a character who you're like, I'm going to do a villain whose evilness is inexplicable, it's not humanized?
You know, at some point I may venture there, but for the purposes of a novel, I'm always curious about the bad actors, the antagonists. Like, how did you become this way? Why do you think being this way is okay? Like, I'm just really genuinely curious. And so when I'm writing, I'm kind of working that out, trying to ask the character, tell me your story. Like, why are you this way? But it would be so interesting to write someone for whom there is no answer to that question.
Yeah.
And that they are just purely evil for evil's sake.
It terrifies me, you know, and like, and I've always wanted to write that too, but I've been like, I don't know how to approach it. I don't know how to find that, and then to not like sensationalize it or romanticize it, or you know, make it right, like a sort of like they're a war god or something.
Right. How do you not make it Ares, the sexy war god? Like, how do you not do that? Right.
Yeah. It's really hard. Whenever I've done it, I'm like, wow, this character is like a inexplicable badass, and now everybody loves that character, and I'm trying to say they're pure evil, you know. But so that is interesting. I'm excited to see if you ever take it on one day. I have a formulation that I want to run by you. Your book's been out now a year. It came out the week before my book came out, and you know, we've sort of watched each other go through maybe the publishing cycles and the like various ways in which it, okay, here's award season, or here's, you know, this sort of thing. But I felt like there was a moment, and here's how I quantify it, when the book stopped belonging to me. And I feel like there was a moment when the collective amount of time that the rest that like all the readers had thought about my character or my characters surpassed the amount of time, the collective amount of time that I thought about my characters. So it took me about 5 years. So I have like 5 years of thinking about these characters. And who knows, I don't know what the collective time for all my readers, but at a certain point, they collectively thought more about these characters than me. And I feel like at that point, the book stopped belonging to me. It was like more of the world. It belonged to the world. And I wonder if you went through a similar process, like, 14 years writing this book. That's a lot of time that you thought about it. But now it might be possible that the world has thought about your book more than you have. And so do you think that the book is now as much the world's as yours, or do you kind of hold on to your authorship?
Sort of still am in relationship with the characters. Two characters in particular, King Akusa and Maggie, still sort of whisper to me occasionally. But for the most part, I felt as though the book stopped being mine the minute it was released. I had spent so much time with that book and could have spent even more time with it if my agent and editor didn't say, it can go now.
Yeah.
In a loop of revision. Because I just, I guess I'm a perfectionist and I just wanted to make sure that everything was right. And they were like, let it go. And once I got to that point of let it go, I really let it go. And was terrified because in letting it go, was I going to be negatively judged? Were people going to say, oh, I'm trying to push the gay/trans agenda? Were religious people going to call me a heretic and say that this book was blasphemous? Were they going to burn it and do all of these sorts of things? If that is happening out in the world because of the pandemic and my distance from the audience, I don't really know. I don't go to Goodreads to read what people are saying. I stopped reading reviews after the first 2 weeks for my own mental health.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Some things did like get through the filter a little bit, and I could see the hostility in some people's perspectives. And I said, okay, that's it. I'm not going to search The Prophets by Robert Jones Jr. anymore on Google. It is now the world's to wrestle with. And if they are quarreling with it, or if they are embracing it, that should be done with the book. And the author, I think, should not have a role. So I don't like to, for example, readers will sometimes email me and ask specific questions. Could you answer what this means in your book? And I say, no, I can't, because that's a relationship between you and the book. And you have to figure that out for what it means to you, because what it means to me is it doesn't mean anything. It's really what it means to you. Like when I'm reading Detransition, baby, and I'm thinking the whole time, Torrey was fucking brave to write this story. Because it's complicated and it skates the liminal space and it's a quandary. And in a time where trans people are so vulnerable, you said, fuck the cishet gays, and wrote it. How did you do that?
Well, see, I couldn't do what you did. I couldn't let go. It's like I had let go when I wrote it, because I came from a sort of scene where it was like that, and it wasn't an ethical thing, it was an art, like the way that ethics interact with art. It was like, your work will be better if you don't think about the people who hate you. You have to write the book as though they don't exist. And then what happened is, so I wrote it that way. And then partly it was, I had no idea it was going to circulate the way it did. I was like, well, 12 people will read it and they'll get my jokes, so no problem. And that gave me the bravery, the idea that it was a small audience. And then there was a big response. There was Goodreads and stuff. And I couldn't do what you did, which is to stop reading after after 2 weeks. I went ahead and read for months. And it's that tipping point that I talk about where similar to you, where it was like, at some point, this book doesn't belong to me anymore. So these Goodreads reviews, they're not for me. And I had to sort of, come to that place. So I was brave while I wrote it, but then I was not brave while during the publishing process. I didn't have the discipline. But there are two things I kind of want to follow up from your answer. One is, I saw an interview with you, and I don't know if it's still there, but this is a great visual for anybody who's watching. In this interview, you panned the camera down and you had a pile of all of your drafts still like this high, and they were just the ones you printed out. They were like in the corner of, I don't know if that's your office, or are they, do you still have that pile? Is that still there?
No, I cleaned it up and put it away because my husband was like, you're gonna have to actually get this together in case you want to donate it to a library or someplace to have your papers. And I'm like, I'm nobody, but yes, a stack that comes up to about my waist of all the revisions. And that is not all of them. That is just the ones that I printed out over the years. The other ones are on floppy disks, some of them. Flash drives. I love when you're writing so long, you have to go back in technology. You're like, yeah, it was on an 8-track. I wrote this one or something, but so that was one of the questions. It's a great visual if people want to go back in these other interviews to see how much it is. But the other thing is, you talked about the characters who still speak to you, and one is Maggie and the other is the King. And I was wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit about the pre-colonial sexuality in Africa. And I have a special interest because about 10 years ago, I lived in Uganda during when Uganda was going through. It was largely fomented by a kind of American evangelical groups. But there's a proxy war happening in Uganda. I don't mean to tell you about it more for the audience, where kind of Western style NGOs and American evangelicals were having to fight around sexuality that they were having in the United States. They sort of exported it to Uganda. And I was friends with a group of Ugandan queers. They went by the name Kuchu, which doesn't exactly mean queer, but it's very similar. And one of the things that was very interesting was the ways that they were explaining, both to, I think, Americans and also to other Ugandans, that these ideas about sexuality that they didn't exist there for a long time. And I know that you did so much research, and then it shows up in the book. And I was wondering if you could talk about what that sexuality looked like before you had Christianity coming in and becoming sort of hegemonic. Well, as a Black queer person, I grew up in a community that was very homophobic because many, in particular, people who ascribe to patriarchal ideals and strict binaries felt as though Black men in particular had to be strong in order to protect the community. And if you were homosexual, or if you said that you felt feminine or womanly, you could not also be strong. You were thereby weak because women are weak. So it's like this undergirding of misogyny, misogynoir. And so I never had a place. I've never had a feeling of safety, whether I was in my own home, in my own neighborhood, or if I crossed to go to school in a primarily white neighborhood. I was always under duress and stress and fear. And what was always sort of at the baseline of that was this spiritual understanding that God did not want me to be this way. So I grew up thinking that way, thinking that I was an abomination and all of these things. But still, there was something in me that was like, but wait, this is who I am naturally. This is like, no one had to do something to me to make me this way. I was always this way. I tell people, my mother even said, I knew you were queer because when you were 2 years old, Josie and the Pussycats would come on. You'd run in the kitchen, get 2 pot tops, and pretend that you were playing the tambourines like Valerie. so it was always there. But in working through the prophets and tackling this particular subject matter, which was the idea of 2 enslaved men in love in antebellum slavery, I had no examples. And I had to do the research to determine how this works, because what I've always heard was the reason why Black people are queer is because slavery perverted us. It was such a horrible rape culture experience that it knocked us off of our normal cisgender heterosexual path. But the research shows that the opposite was actually true. When you go back through all of this reading and all of the oral history in particular, you find out that numerous villages and peoples and nations on the continent of Africa had really what we would consider contemporary ideas about gender, sexuality, and gender identity. So, for example, there was the Dagara people of what is now Burkina Faso. And if they had a queer or trans person reveal themselves as child or as adult in their community, they would celebrate, because what that meant for them was, we have a guardian for the gates. And what they meant by that was someone who can speak to the ancestors in their spiritual realm and communicate to us what we need to do to protect ourselves, to grow our nation, and things of that nature. And this sort of thing in various remixes existed all over the continent until European colonization and Christian missionaries and also Islamic missionaries came in, saw this and said, this is disgusting, this is against God, you must stop. And through sheer force of their power, were able to convince these indigenous Africans, yes, this must be wrong. And now we've internalized that idea as though it is ours. But it's really interesting that once you go back and you unpack and interrogate this narrative, you find really that queerness is inherently African, because there's this saying that, to be queer is to be un-African. No, like queerness is a natural part of human reality, whether on the continent of Africa or in Europe, wherever. And the reasons for why they force us to not be queer or not be trans or not be non-binary is because it serves capitalism for us not to be. We can be in these relationships that they put us in so that we can keep producing soldiers and laborers so that the rich get richer and they can storm other nations and steal their resources and don't have to send their own children or don't have to get their own hands dirty. And it was really interesting to find all of that.
Yeah, what you just said reminds me of an interview I saw with Chino Achebe, that I watched a long time ago, where it was later in his life, and he said that I think this, I might forget, it's a long time since I read the book, but Okonkwo, I think, is the protagonist of Things Fall Apart, and that the fatal flaw of Okonkwo was obviously it was colonialists who came and ruined things, but the tragic flaw was that because he was under duress, he felt he could only lean into his masculinity to protect him, that he was out of balance. And that was really interesting for me to that, that also the results of colonialism was that you had to fall back on a kind of nationalism, on a hyper masculinity to protect yourself, and that itself was a kind of like your own defense was a kind of self-destruct, or one's own defense was a kind of self-destruction. That sorry, go on.
In that book, you know, I'm thinking of you jogged my memory, because now I'm thinking of him, Okonkwo, recognizing that his daughter was a natural leader, and still not allowing her to take that position simply because she was a girl.
Yeah.
That's such a brilliant book for so many reasons.
That book is incredible. I mean, it's interesting. He said that he would never again write about that period after he wrote it, and everything that he wrote subsequent, was much more recent history. And I saw an interview with you where you said that you probably also won't return to this time frame. Is it? Can you talk a little bit about that?
It's a really difficult time period to tackle because of the utter brutality of it. I had to detach, oddly enough, while writing it. I had to go to a really academic place about what I was writing so that I wouldn't be harmed. And then at the same time, get as close to it as I possibly could so that I could understand. So it's this weird sort of cognitive dissonance that happens when you're working in this particular time period. Although I would say my next novel, which is going to be much more contemporary, there is also some of that happening, strangely. But I don't think I will ever write about that time period ever again, but I might write about a time before that and expand on, like King Akusa's period of time. But I don't think I could do antebellum slavery again. I think once is enough for me, and that there are other stories to be told about that period that should be told by other people.
Yeah, that makes sense. I like the richness of like many voices on things that are really difficult. I have a question. This is my own personal interest. But I see, behind you, you've got Toni Morrison, you've got James Baldwin. And so I read, and obviously Son of Baldwin, the people don't know that the group, the community and the ways that you've engendered all this thought. So I know I want to ask you my Baldwin question, basically, is what I'm getting at. So I read, I had put off reading Giovanni's Room. Like I had read a lot of other Baldwin, Native Son, I read all these things. And then at the beginning of the pandemic, I was like, why haven't I read Giovanni's Room? And so I read Giovanni's Room, and I had this sense, and this is without any research. This is just me thinking about it and feeling that that the Giovanni's Room was maybe the book he would have wanted to write had he not lived in a racist country and like had this baggage. Do you think that that's true? Like it seemed like this book that was like very aesthetic, kind of like a high modernist style, and that it was, I don't know, playing with sort of stuff, but that there was a difference between the writer that he maybe wanted to be or wanted the freedom to be and the writer that he was called to be. Does that make any sense to you?
It makes a total amount of sense. I actually saw an interview with him where he talked about why so many things in Giovanni's Room were distant from his own experience, that the characters were white, that they were in Europe, that, all of these sorts of things. He said he didn't think the world could handle his full self, like Black and gay. Okay, they could not take it. So he had to, give it to them in a dose he think that they could handle. And when you think about it, he's writing this book in the 1950s.
Yeah, it's revolutionary. Like Incredible. Speaking of bravery, yeah.
With his flourishes and his dandy self, and his mid-Atlantic accent and his cigarettes, and he's clearly queer to anyone who is looking, and he is also one of the most brilliant people you're ever going to meet in your life. And he had to navigate all of that in really difficult ways. And also there was, I think, Baldwin never identified as queer or gay. He was a little early. He didn't quite, he at one point didn't even understand the gay rights movement. He thought it didn't make any sense. But toward his later years, he's just like, no, now I get it. And so he was dealing with a lot of self-loathing and attempts to appease a community that he was battling on behalf of. I don't know if you know that like toward the 60s and 70s, Baldwin started to fall out of favor because more militant leaders were looked toward. And one in particular, Black Panther, hated Baldwin with a passion and like was extremely homophobic toward Baldwin. And Baldwin's response to that was, he's not really mad at me. He's mad at the really, really effeminate gay ones that make it bad for all of us. And I was like, oh, that's okay. That tells me a whole lot about what Baldwin was dealing with internally.
Yeah. That, I mean, that totally makes sense to me. I wonder, I guess, I mean, but this question was kind of also a preamble to a question that I wanted to ask you, because it's something that I think about myself, which is do you think there's a difference between the writer that you want to be and the writer that you're maybe called to be? Or are they the same for you?
Ooh, that is a wonderful question. That is such a good question. There is a difference. I exist in this Black queer body, and my art comes from that intersection. And so to some degree, whether large or small, I always have to respond in that intersection. Although I do battle it, I say, I'll read my work and then recognize something where I'm responding to an oppression, and I'll say, no. That's not my job. My job is this art, and so let me find another way to tackle this. But to imagine being a writer who does not, is not limited by the world, who sees me as this Black queer thing, to have the freedom to write like a white cishet man does about any subject, and to speak with authority whether they have it or not. What liberation, what freedom.
Yeah.
To not have the responsibility of being responsible.
Yeah, to not have to represent,
Right.
that burden. Yeah, I think about that a lot. I think of, and I mean, that's what I think is interesting about the idea that you said about that there can be other antebellum novels, and that the more there is, the less each one has to represent, right? Like the next antebellum novel that has two Black characters that are queer, that are having these kinds of relationships, that's no longer doing the same, having to do the same work, that I think. And that then there can be differentiation. And like I think about this a lot as a trans writer, that and this will be my last question before it opens up, but that it took me a while as a trans writer that I was dealing with this stuff, and I wanted to, I felt this pressure to be the only one, like I felt a kind of pressure to where it was like, well, if somebody writes this book that's about motherhood and transness, which is what my book is about, for people who haven't read it, that the next time then that's going to preempt me. What do I get? No one's going to want to know if there's another one. And it took me a long time to get past a sense of competition. I realized that if somebody else does a trans motherhood book, it actually frees me up to not have to, that I can riff at a higher level because so much work has already been done. And I mean, that's what I thought about when you were talking about, like, there should be many people with their many voices, because each one allows the next person to riff at that higher level. And so this is a long question, but I promise I'm getting to a point here, which is, I think I hear what you're saying, and I hear the ways that you've gone through, like, I assume you've gone through different work around competition around this. And I think that one of the things that's really amazing is the way that every time I've dealt with you, every time I've read your work, you refer to other authors. The back of your book is a list of people. I mean, it's a very powerful list of people who've made a difference to you. And when I watch you and I hear you, it, like, there doesn't seem to be actually a sense of competition with those other writers. So first part of the question, very simply, is am I correct in that you don't feel that you've kind of worked through a kind of competition?
Yeah. I do not feel competition with other writers. I feel now competition with the prophets for this second novel. Like, how do I make it different? How do I make it better? Those sorts of things. But from other writers, I'm inspired. Like, Detransition, baby, like, opened my mind up in ways that, like, freed me to now write past the margins of the book, of paper, of in between the lines and backwards if I want to. So I read other authors with reverence, because I'm only inspired by other writers. I couldn't dare see another writer as a competitor, and the industry works to make it that way. To, like, especially for people like us who live at intersections and margins, you are the only one. That sort of thing. And so, no, I don't want to be the only one. I want my trans sisters and brothers. I want my queer folk. I want everybody around me writing, and so that we're writing so that it's no longer exceptional, that it's regular. Yeah,
I agree with you, and I admire it. And now let me throw out just one thing that I saw that made a difference to me, which is, like, so I feel like I went through a similar thing, and now I'm curious. I don't know if this is right, but I'm curious about the idea of reclaiming competition, right? That competition has always been presented to me as something that, that separates me from people who I should be in coalition with. But I saw, this is a really, really, probably not the best example, but during COVID too, I watched the documentary with Michael Jordan. Did you see that, the documentary?
Yes.
And I just really loved how petty he was. He's so petty. Like, he's such a bitch. Like, and that you had these moments where he would be like, I'm tired. I don't want to play anymore. And then he'd go to a restaurant and he'd see, like, the coach of the other team, and he'd be like, that coach didn't say hello to me, or, like, I didn't raise his glass to me when I raised my glass. And then in the next game, you see this footage of him where he was just destroying the other team. It was just, like, amazing show that you've never seen. And every time that he made a basket, he would look at the coach and he'd be like, "That's what you get. That's what you get for not raising your glass to me," or whatever it was. And the coach was like, "I have no idea what this happened." And I've been thinking about whether or not it's, like, possible to, like, reclaim, like, pettiness on my own terms, like, where it's, like, not pettiness from the industry, but pettiness where it's like, I admire that person. I know that to rise, like, maybe to rise, I'm too tired as, like, to be, like, wholesome or to be giving or whatever. But sometimes I still have a little pettiness and spare, And I wonder if that has any resonance for you, because I see you so good at making those, genuine gestures.
Well, I do know that the closest I get to that is when people tell me I can't do something. Like when I was in the MFA program, some of my other, my classmates were very harsh on me because they, why are you writing about Black things? You're in danger of becoming a Black writer. And while that wounded me, it also said, okay, I'm gonna show you why I'm a Black writer. So in that sense, yes, I get that urge and that energy. But in terms of like other writers though, like the closest I guess I get to it is I'll read a Toni Morrison novel like Song of Solomon or something, and I'll go, damn, how did she do that? How can I be that good? And then I just try and fail, but try. But otherwise, no, I don't feel a sense of competition. Pettiness.
I'll just remain petty over here myself. We've got some questions from the audience, and let me open it up. Let's see here. Douglas says, this conversation about writing characters who are pure evil is interesting because our writing establishment, wait a second. Brooke, she says she's going to answer this question live, but I'll just ask it. This conversation about writing characters who are pure evil is interesting because our writing establishment preaches that even the most evil villain has to have at least one redeeming characteristic. Is this one of those rules that invites to be broken? Yeah.
That is a rule that invites to be broken. Like, we have to leave room for that. It's a possibility that some people might actually just be pure evil. Maybe not all evil people are pure evil, but there has to be some who are. Like, that's because this is existence and all possibilities have to be possible. So
yeah. I'm always curious about how it might be done. Did you read Blood Meridian?
No.
I felt like that was the judge in that character was as close as I've seen to an unredeemable. I don't know how people. That book is a very polarizing book, but yeah, he's pretty evil. Robert, you talked about finding freedom and liberation in your writing process. Was there a particular event or impetus that allowed you to find that freedom, or was it something you always had?
I did not always have a sense of freedom or liberation. I tried very hard for a very long time to shrink myself down and just be invisible, because if people didn't see me, then they couldn't harm me. But writing, and maybe I misspoke in saying that I find liberation and freedom in writing. What I find in it is space. Maybe not even a safe space, but a safer space to explore. It's so weird because when I'm writing, I can be anything. I can do anything. There are no limitations. So I guess in a sense that is a kind of freedom, but I'm also always aware of how that is just on the page and that I have to actually return to a corporeal place that does not have those same safeties. So I'm liberated, I guess, when I'm writing, or at least because Baldwin said that safety is an illusion. So I have the illusion of liberation while I'm writing.
That is very powerfully said, and it resonates with me. There's another question that is kind of related, which is, it's the question is, brave is a subject that's come up a few times in discussion. I'm wondering what empowers you to be brave when writing. Is there kind of literary bravery that you admire, reach for, or is it bravery a natural part of the process? And I guess you've answered partly that in the last question, but I'm curious about that the word maybe process here, which is there a way, do you have techniques for doing this? Like, I know, for instance, sometimes, like, I'm trying this thing right now where I get up at 5 a.m. in the morning to write, specifically because not only am I tired, but my inner critic is tired. So the part of me that's like, you can't do this, blah, 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 that part of me is also sleepy. And so in some ways, like, if I can just start sleeping, if I can just start writing basically while I'm asleep, the critic has to wake up too. And by the time the critic wakes up, I'm already writing. Do you have ways that do you have a process for being brave when you write?
Brave, so many people mistake it for fearlessness. And I am not a fearless person. I am filled with fears. Even when I appear to be brave because I've decided to do this thing that could potentially put me in danger from others. Because I guess the definition then of courage is being afraid and doing it anyway. If that is this case, then I guess I'm courageous or brave, but rather, like you, I get up at 3 o'clock in the morning to write because that is when I hear the voices most clearly. My inner critic talks to me all the time, no matter what. Oh, this is terrible. And I'm always that way. I'll write a line on Wednesday and go, that is really good. And on Thursday, this is trash. So
Yeah.
my inner critic is always on and always talking. I just write while he's talking and put myself sort of out there. Like I just have this thing where I allow myself to be vulnerable because I know that's the only way in which I will get this done. If I falter, if I don't do what is in my heart to do, if I don't write, I'll explode. So I have to do it, even if I think it's trash, even if I think people are going to hate it and are going to drag me on social media and are going to do all of these things that are going to make my life less joyful. I have to do it anyway. And the other thing is, I think too, that bravery is sort of overrated because why do I have to be brave? Like the problem is that other people are so inhumane that I have to be brave to write this thing that is the fault of these other people who can't imagine a better world to live in, you know?
Yeah.
Like I'm tired of being brave. Like, you be brave and look at me as a human being. How about that?
Yeah, absolutely. The thing you just mentioned too that you talked about is I'm wondering if we could just maybe close on this, because I think in some ways there's more people in this conversation than just the two of us, and that's you talked about in your writing process the way that characters speak to you, you know, and that like you'll have character, and I have this too a little bit where it happens to me, and I wonder to what degree this is like for you mystical versus secular. It happens to me in a way where I sometimes don't know which it is, where like I'll try and make a character do something and the character is like, I don't do that, you know? And lots of times I hear the character's voice, not by what they're telling me to do, but what they refuse to let me make them do. And, you know, there's so many voices in here and in the prophets, they all feel so real. And you talk about even still Maggie, you know, speaking to you. I'm wondering if you can just talk about like break it down for me, how that works for you, that difference between, is it mystical? Is it logic? Is it like, in what ways are they speaking to you?
the answer to your question is I don't know either. But I do know that, like you said, what will happen sometimes is I'll sit down at the computer at 3 o'clock in the morning, which is the magic hour, the witching hour, when Brooklyn is super quiet, my house is super quiet, but I can still hear a noise, like an underlying ringing or buzzing sound. And then at some point, it starts to sound like people are whispering in the between those noises. And I try to listen and hear for those. And I don't know if that's my own subconscious, if that's ancestral voices, if that's the spirits surrounding me trying to tell me something. I have no idea. My left brain says that, that's you talking to yourself. That's how your creative mind works. But I also like to think that there's something mystical happening, something supernatural happening. But it is an actual thing where I then get into this zone my husband calls the head in the clouds moments, where I'm writing something at a pace that my fingers can't even keep up with. It's just coming so fast. And then I'm done. And then I walk away for a couple of days and I come back and I say, I don't even remember writing this.
Yeah.
It doesn't sound like me. I like it. It's nice, but it almost feels like it was being channeled from some other place. And there's so little we know about reality. So I don't know. Is it my counterpart in the multiverse talking to me and telling me something? I have no idea.
Yeah. Well, usually the last question of these things is, what are you working on right now? But given what you said, I kind of want to just do a little twist on that question and say, what are the voices that are talking to you right now? Can you share that, or is that too private?
There is one young man who is a problem. He's essentially a nice guy, but he does some fucked up shit. And he is talking to me kind of smarmy like he knows he's a asshole, but I'm good looking too, so you're gonna tell my story. And that's who's talking to me right now.
That's amazing. I mean, and I think I want to ask other people that question, because I think that feels like a bit of life that makes me so. I mean, I would always, of course, be so eager to read what you're doing next, but I want to meet that guy. So
wait, I want to, before we go, I want to ask you, are we going to have something, Torrey, please, from you?
I'm in Colombia now as a sort of writer's retreat, like a I'm pretty lucky to be here, but it's not an organized thing. I came down to try and get things done. So I'm working on the last novella in a novella quartet right now, and I'm really excited by it. And it's the same thing. Where it is not what I expected that I'd be writing. Something happened. I found, I don't know if it's a groove, or it doesn't feel exactly like a voice to me. It just feels like a flow. That some mornings I get the flow, and where it takes me is weird right now. I don't know if I've written anything quite like it. I don't even know if I agree with it. It's like the flow is taking me to this place, and I feel like in the editing process, I'd be like, I don't know, I just have to let this argument stand, even if I don't. I'll see what the world thinks of it.
Listen, if it scares you, it's good.
Yeah. So that is the best writing advice that I think you could give. Well, I think we've hit our hour. I could do this for all day, or all night. So, but I realize that I don't get that much time.
I do think, it's been an absolutely stunning conversation. Thank you both so much. And what a note to end on. If it scares you, you're doing it right. To paraphrase, I don't think that, but what an amazing note to end on, and what an incredible conversation. Thank you, Robert, and thank you, Torrey, for this just wonderful, wonderful evening. If you have a second, there's a few folks, saying thank you and saying nice things in the chat. So feel free to peek at that. And on that note, thank you to our audience for asking great questions and for joining us this evening. I did drop a link in the chat earlier. I'll do it one more time just so if you need it, you have it. But if you want to get either Robert or Torrey's books, the link that I just dropped will be live until 9 a.m. tomorrow morning. That's Eastern time. And you can get a book plate for the paperback copy of The Prophets. But yeah, I mean, thank you so much. So stunned by this wonderful conversation. So again, thank you, Torrey. Thank you, Robert. And thank you to our incredible audience. I hope everybody has a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Robert, for the conversation and the book.